Hi friends! Have any of you ever wondered what would happen if you went overboard on an airplane? I'm not talking about skydiving, but just like that, with nothing, wearing only your clothes, at tremendous speed and altitude. How long can a person stay alive if he finds himself in such a situation? And in general, is it even possible at all? And most importantly, who would dare to take such a step? Our story is just about one such case, which occurred under very strange circumstances with a man who did not expect it at all. And the reason for this incident, which went down in world history as the only one in the whole history of aviation, will surprise you even more. Be sure to watch this video until the end. On June 10, 1990, at 7:20 a.m., flight BA 5390 left Birmingham Airport in England to take passengers to Malaga, Spain. On board were 81 passengers and 6 experienced crew members. The plane was lifted into the air by co-pilot Alastair Achason. He soon handed over the controls to the crew chief, 42-year-old Timothy Lancaster. Everything went according to plan, and nothing seemed to suggest disaster. The team had already made hundreds of such flights. 13 minutes after takeoff, the plane was over Didcot, Oxfordshire, at 5,300 meters above the ground. The flight was going normally. The pilots had their shoulder straps undone and relaxed, and the aircraft commander loosened his lap straps a little as well. The estimated flight time was about 2 hours, so there was silence in the cockpit after a few jokes. At the same time, the smiling stewardesses started serving food to the passengers. It was early, so many of them were getting ready for a nap and expected to spend the flight in peace and quiet. No one at the time could have imagined that an ordinary flight would quickly turn into a unique survival race. Just as Captain Timothy was settling into his seat, a loud bang came out of nowhere. The human eye didn't even register what had happened. It happened in a split second. The left windshield, which was on the commander's side, just flew out of the cockpit. The rush of air coming out of the plane threw the 42-year-old Lancaster, the crew chief, up and over with great force. He was torn from his seat and went through the windshield out of the cockpit. The man's back was pinned to the outside of the fuselage, but luckily his legs were caught between the steering wheel and the dashboard of the plane. The plane decompressed, causing the cockpit door to tear off and fall onto the instrument panel, damaging the connection with land. Flight attendant Nigel Ogden, who was also in the cockpit at the time, oriented himself in time and grabbed the captain's legs tightly with his hands and tried to hold on with the rest of his body to the seat. I heard a noise, I turned around and saw that the front window was gone. It had disappeared somewhere, and Timothy was slipping through the opening. He was sucked out so I could only see his legs, the man later tells. The co-pilot, Alastair, took control of the plane. He turned on the autopilot and tried to repair the wrecked equipment and contact land services. He had no luck, but after a while he did see a signal, but it was of little use. The pilot just could not hear the answers from the ground because of the wind noise in the cockpit. It was real chaos, because no one had ever trained pilots for this. Meanwhile, the flight attendant's strength began to wane. He felt that he simply could not cope alone and would not be able to hold the commander. But out of the last of his strength, he wrapped his arms around him even tighter and held his legs. He cried out loudly through his teeth and called for help from the rest of the crew, who were already in the cabin. Hearing the screams and finding that the doors were just gone, 2 stewards came running to him. Despite their combined efforts, the captain slipped out of the cabin a few more inches with only his shoes and ankle-deep feet in the cabin. I grabbed Tim's legs, but I almost got sucked out of the cabin myself. At the last moment, the steward, John, pulled me back in by the strap. Everything in the cabin kept ripping and sucking me out. The oxygen tank, which was securely fastened, nearly blew my head off and flew away like a matchbox. I felt like I couldn't hold Tim any longer. I would have been good for another 20 seconds. Thank God one of the guys strapped on his ankle and secured it to the chair. It was unclear what to do next. Everything was flying and rushing around in the cockpit, and most importantly, we realized that we had 81 passengers on board, and it would be very difficult to land the plane in such a situation. It was also not clear how long the other windows would last, because they could fly out after the first one, and then there would definitely be a crash. A few minutes passed like that. Someone there said, "We have to let Tim go." But Nigel said he would never do this, and said he would have to look his wife and children in the eye. At this time, Nigel himself had already begun to get frostbite. The crew were sure that Lancaster was dead, but they were afraid to let him go, because the wind could have thrown his body into the left engine and put it out of action. Flight attendant Susan Giben was calming the passengers and asking them to fasten their seatbelts. The co-pilot, Alastair, began an emergency landing and then transmitted a distress signal. Sometimes the captain's face could be seen through the side window. His eyes were open and unblinking, despite the strong air current. Eventually, the crew did manage to establish communication with the land. The co-pilot requested a landing in London at the well-known Gatwick Airport, where he could land with his eyes closed. But land services decided to land flight BA 5390 at Southampton Airport, which was much closer. 22 minutes after the cabin depressurized, Alastair successfully landed the plane on the airport's second runway at 7:55. There was no emergency evacuation. Timothy Lancaster was lifted into the cockpit and evacuated from the plane on a stretcher. Among the 87 people on board, 81 passengers and 6 crew members, only 2 were injured. All passengers exited the plane as normal through the normal exits. Among the injured was Nigel Ogden, with a dislocated shoulder, frostbitten face, and left eye. He looked more like a Navy SEAL who had just returned from combat. But in spite of all this, he never let go of his friend. But the most amazing thing was that when the crew commander was dragged back in, Timothy was not only alive, he was even able to make a joke. During the unrealistic 22 minutes that the captain spent overboard at 800 kilometers per hour at 5,000 meters, he only got frostbite, bruises, a fractured right arm, and a finger on his left hand. But despite all that, literally 5 months later, the pilot was back at the helm. After that, he flew a huge number of hours, and at the age of 55, he was retired according to British Airways rules. He is married and has 5 grandchildren. Stewart Nigel Ogden returned to work after a short break, but suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. He later chose a different profession. The co-pilot, Alastair, who landed the plane, worked in aviation for another 25 years. But what caused the glass to separate from the cockpit after all? The investigation found that 84 of the 90 bolts that secured the glass were smaller in diameter than required, and the other bolts were 2.5 millimeters shorter. The installation of the new windshield had just been completed a few hours before the flight, and the shift supervisor had not checked the documentation, but simply looked at the bolts that were similar to those previously installed and estimated them by eye, and was only wrong by 1 size. That is all for today. Write your opinion about the incident and rate the video. See you soon!